Chapter 6. In the fall of 1793, the city of Philadelphia was recovering from the shock of a summer long epidemic of yellow fever. Before it was over, 4,000 people had died and many had fled the city to escape danger. Housewives were either too sick or too busy to wash their doorsteps twice a week, as they normally did. And when the watchman went through the streets at 10 o'clock in the evening, calling, "All is well," everyone knew that all was far from well. Those who stayed behind walked in the middle of the street in an effort to avoid contagion. They burned tar and sprinkled their clothes with vinegar, vinegar, hoping this would keep them safe. Jefferson went to a little resort in the suburbs. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, but Hamilton caught the fever, only a light case, and he recovered rapidly. Among those who died were Mr. and Mrs. Todd, an elderly couple who had been cared for right up to the end by their lawyer son, John Todd. John had moved his wife, Dolly Payne Todd, their year-old son, Payne, and their brand new baby to the country before returning to his parents. When they died, he rushed back to Dolly, but time he by the time he too was sick and died almost immediately. Dolly and the little baby both caught the fever, and although the baby died, Dolly recovered. When the epidemic was over, Dolly and little Payne, Precious Payne, she called him, returned to Philadelphia at about the same time as James Madison arrived. James did not know Dolly, but during the next months he undoubtedly heard of her, and since she lived just a block from where Congress met, he met even here seen her. She was such a beauty that it was said that men stationed themselves so they could watch her pass. If James too had stationed himself, he would have seen a striking 25-year-old with blue eyes and black hair, dressing in the plain clothes worn by Quakers. She was the same height as James and had such a friendly air about her and that James would not have been intimidated. Indeed, possibly through seeing her, and certainly through hearing about her, she worked on James's imagination until he was almost persuaded that she was the one. His chief enforcement his chief enforcement was his old Princeton friend Aaron Burr, who had once lived in at the border house that Dolly's mother ran and knew Dolly well. The story of Dolly's family was a sad one. Although Dolly's mother had long been a Quaker, her father John was converted from his marriage. Once he became a Quaker, however, he was a wholehearted one. Although at that time the Paynes lived on a plantation in Virginia, it went against John's conscience to own slaves, and as soon as Virginia made it legal to free them, Payne freed his, sold his plantation, and moved to Philadelphia, where he opened a starch business. Starch was a poor choice. Even in prosperous times, he would have had to sell a lot of starch to support a family. And the time was not good. Before long, John Payne had to declare bankruptcy. The Quakers, however, disapproved of bankruptcy. They disapproved of all debts, even when they were unviable, so they disowned John Payne. Why no longer allowed him They no longer allowed him to attend their meetings. He was out. John Payne was so depressed that he shut himself up in his bedroom and never came out. 2 years later, he died. If asked, Aaron Burr would have said no, he did not think Dolly's Quaker faith would stand in the way of her considering marriage to a non-Quaker. Several of her sisters had married non-Quakers and had been disowned, but she did not seem overly upset by this. Moreover, he had made Aaron another non-Quaker, the legal guardian of her precious pain. The only negative thing that Ehrenberg could have found to say about Dolly was that she was related to Patrick Henry. Her mother was Patrick's cousin. James would have laughed. If it turned out that he liked Dolly and Dolly liked him, he wasn't going to worry about Patrick Henry. So in the spring, when Dolly had had enough time to recover from her first grief, and before other suitors began beating their way to her door, he asked Aaron Burr to arrange an introduction. Dolly went into a flurry of excitement as soon as she received the message from Aaron. James Madison, no less, the famous Madison. She couldn't receive him without having another woman present. Dolly's 13-year-old sister, Anna, was living with her, but Dolly wanted her best friend, Eliza Collins, to come not only from the sake of antique, but to share the excitement. She dashed off a note. Thou must come to me, Aaron Burr, says the great little Madison, has asked to be brought out to see me this evening. What to wear? Dolly, who loved bright colors, had never been allowed to wear them because of Quaker restrictions, but she did have a mulberry satin dress, which may have been just within, or perhaps just without, the bounds of the Quaker code. She tied a kerchief to her neck and set a lace cap on her head. There, she was ready. For his part, Madison bought a new round beaver hat, but in spite of a certain degree of nervousness that they both must have felt, the evening went well. Dolly was a warm person with a natural gift for making people feel at ease, and however she steered the conversation, she must have brought out the kindness and the humor that so often lay hidden under the surface of Madison's personality. In any case, James Madison fell headlong in love, began making regular calls, and within a few months was proposing marriage. Dolly was not sure. She certainly admired Madison, which is what she always called him. She suspected she could never find more considerate stepfather for her precious pain. But was this enough? In June, she told James that she was visiting relatives in Virginia. While she thought it over, meanwhile, James went home to Montpelier for the summer and waited for her answer. But he didn't remain silent. He encouraged Dolly's cousin, Catherine, who lived nearby, to impress Dolly with how much he loved her. He thinks so much of you in the day, Catherine wrote Dolly, that he lost his tongue. A night he dreams of you and starts in his sleep. At last, in August, Dolly wrote Madison that she had made up her mind. The answer was yes. Madison was exuberant and wrote right back, I hope you will never have another deliberation. If the sentiment of my heart can guarantee those of yours, there can never be a cause for it. The wedding was on September 15th at the Virginia home of Dolly's sister, Lucy. Marriage to George Steptoe Washington, nephew of the president. There is no record of what Dolly wore, but she was obviously no longer going to obey the dictates of the Quaker's faith. She had on her finger her engagement ring of rose diamonds, and around her neck an elaborate necklace of carved medallions, which James gave her as a wedding present. This was the first jewelry Dolly had ever worn. As a little girl, she had treasured a locket her grandmother had given her in secret, since jewelry was forbidden to Quakers, but had kept it hidden and was heartbroken when she lost it. But now, since she expected to be disowned, she was free to have the pretty things she had once only admired. On the day of her wedding, however, Dolly still had mixed feelings. She wrote Eliza Collins just before the ceremony, in this union I have everything that is soothing and grateful in respect, in prospect, and my little pain will have a generous and kind protector. But she must have still wondered if this was enough. She signed her letter Dolly Payne Todd. But after the ceremony, she added a proscript Evening Dolly Madison. Alas, alas! She probably did not regret the step she had taken, but she did recognize that there was no turning back, and alas, this was rather scary. Dolly needn't to worry. The affection she felt for Madison developed gradually into genuine love, and Madison so adored Dolly that he accepted precious pain, spoiled and obnoxious as everyone else found him, with more patience than he might have shown a child of his own. Dolly and James never had children. Indeed, precious pain was a problem all his life, one his mother refused to admit, yet for her sake, Madison never complained. Dolly, in turn, flung herself enthusiastically into her husband's political career, learning the ins and outs of government, rejoicing in Madison's political victories, grieving over defeats. After some years, Dolly described their marriage. Our hearts understand each other, she wrote. While the Madisons were on their honeymoon, the United States faced its first small insurrection. The farmers in the western Pennsylvania resented the tax that had been placed on whiskey. For them, it was not a tax on a luxury item, it stuck at the source of their income. Since it was impossible to transport the grain they grew over the mountains, they converted it to whiskey and sent the whiskey east to be sold, claiming that they had been unfairly discriminated against. They petitioned the government for relief, and when that didn't work, they began tarring and feathering those who opposed them, burning barns, and in general intimidating, eluding, and resisting tax collectors. This was only a brief spurt of rebellion, however, which petered out once the farmers learned that in the East, they were being accused of treason. Like everyone else, Madison disapproved of breaking laws for any reason. But in the end, he was more afraid of Alexander Hamilton's reaction than he was of Pennsylvania's farmers. Hamilton seemed to jump at any chance to play the hero. In a brand new general uniform, he rode to Pennsylvania with an army of 15,000 military men, as though he were going to conquer the West. The uprising was over by the time he got there, and to the people of Pennsylvania he presented a foolish spectacle. This self important man rounding up farmers from their fields while his troops tramped down the countryside. In the end, he marched 20 so called ringleaders to Philadelphia, but eventually they were freed and sent home. What Madison feared was Hamilton's tough talk. If a lesson were not to made If a lesson were not made of these men, Hamilton insisted, the next storm would be worse. The gentleman needed a standing army ready to put down future troublemakers at a moment's notice. And if there were one thing that Madison dreaded more than any other, it was talk of a standing army. Any government with a standing army had more power than could easily be controlled. As far as Madison could see, the Whiskey Rebellion was no encouragement to future storms, as Hamilton would have people believe. It was a warning against them. But in November, as the Madisons settled down in Philadelphia, in their rented three-store brick house, Madison was less troubled by the Whiskey Rebellion than he was by the Great Britain, which was making it all but impossible for Americans to remain neutral in the war in Europe, or neutral. The Royal Navy had been ordered to seize all food on American ships bound for France, and because British claimed the West Indian ports for their exclusive use, They began capturing Americans and American ships found there. They stopped American ships at sea to search for British seamen who might have deserted to join them more lenient American Navy if they felt like it. They only discouraged Americans' sovereignty. It only simply did not bother to abide by the peace treaty both nations had signed at the end of the war. James Madison found this behavior intolerable. Long before his marriage to Dolly, he had introduced a bill placing heaver duties on British goods as a penalty for their hostility. But the Federalists would have nothing to do with Madison's bill. Great Britain would just get mad. They said, then where would they be? Back at war again. Still, they knew that something had to be done. Washington divided and decided to send an envoy to London to try to negotiate the difference between the two countries. But the opinion of Madison and Jefferson, he picked the wrong man. John Jay, like Hamilton, John Jay had once worked closely with Madison to secure the ratification of the Constitution, and like Hamilton, he had turned into a staunch Federalist. So while Dolly and James started the business of housekeeping, the whole country awaited the outcome of Jay's mission. Rumors seeped across the Atlantic that Americans would not be happy with the results of the negotiation. But it was not until after Congress had adjourned on March 3rd, 1795, that the actual text of Jay's treaty arrived in Philadelphia. The rumors were correct. No one liked the treaty. There was not a word in it about the capture of American sailors, or the searching of American ships. No recognition of America's right to ship food to France, and although American ships were allowed into West India ports, there were so many ifs and buts to this provision. It was meaningless. In other words, John Jay, always known as an admirer of Great Britain, had come home empty handed. He may have done the best he could, but people felt he had sold out, and they were outraged. They were not believe they could not believe that Senate would ratify the treaty. Yet the Senate, still afraid of war with Great Britain, did, and Washington signed it. Nothing that happened in post war America caused such disruption. Rioting broke out in major cities. Stones were thrown at Hamilton when he spoke in defense of the treaty, and John Jay was burned in effigy in so many towns. He said that he could have found his way across the country by the light from the fires. But James Madison was not ready to give up. He admitted that only the Senate had the right to approve or disapprove a treaty, yet only the House of Representatives had the right to spend money or without withhold money. So, if the House refused to put certain measures of the treaty into effect, didn't that automatically kill the treaty itself? He argued that rejection of the treaty should not anger Britain. It simply affirmed that the independence of the United States. Madison told Jefferson that he felt sure that the Republicans would win the vote on April 29th. But as it turned out, they lost by one vote. The Federalists had 50 votes, the Republicans 49. Madison and Jefferson were shocked at the outcome. If the Federalists were this, this successful, they said the Republicans would have to work harder to strengthen their party. The only way to save America, they decided, was to make sure that the Republicans did well in future elections. Washington waited until September 1796 to make their formal announcement that he would not seek a third term. And since elections were held in November, there was not much time for the Republicans to build up their strength. John Adams would certainly run as the Federalist choice for president, and whether Jefferson wanted to or not, the Republicans put his name on their ticket. If he didn't become president this time, he surely would the next time. 18,000, 1800s. As for the coming election, the Republicans had little doubt that Jefferson would at least come in second, which would make him vice president. It worked out just as Madison had anticipated, although he had hoped for more on March 4th, 1797. John Adams was inaugurated President of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson became Vice President, and James Madison retired from a public life. The Federalists scoffed at the news of Madison's retirement. Yes, he'd take some time off, they said, but like Jefferson, he'd be back on the public stage, and indeed, it is hard to imagine that Madison surely believed that he could abandon politics forever. Still, he did look forward to life at Montpelier with Dolly. From Philadelphia, he shipped 5 bushels of clover seed to Montpelier, 18 chairs, and 16 boxes and trunks. He and Dolly had so much personal baggage they had to hire extra horses to carry it all. Since his father was laid up with rheumatism, James took over the management of the plantation. He had long ago given up the idea that he could manage without slaves, but he never ceased to feel guilty about owning them. One can't help but wonder what he thought of Dolly's father, who freed his slaves and gave up his livelihood rather than betray his principles. Did he admire John Payne for his courage? Or did John Payne simply prove how impractical it was to take such a solitary stand? Much as Madison and Jefferson abhorred slavery, it probably never occurred to them that they could abandon Monticello and Montpelier. and they recognized that it would be impossible to maintain their homes without slaves. Yet, even if they could, they had been brought up to believe that ex slaves would never be able to survive in a white society without being cruelly discriminated against. Later, they would come up with the idea that certain territories in the West could be set aside for the settlement of ex slaves, or perhaps they could be relocated in Africa. Apparently, no one asked the slaves what they thought. James, one time, seemed of becoming independent by the sale of the Mohawk property he had bought came to nothing. When he sold it in 1796, he had just enough money to put up a grist mill on the plantation. In the business now, he of fixing up the house, he ordered marble for a fireplace and arranged to buy 50,000 nails handmade at Jefferson's Monticello factory. From Philadelphia, he ordered 190 French window panes. Although he seemed to be fully occupied with planting and building, and like any other farmer watching settlements far from Philadelphia, the trouble now was with France. Already angry at the way Jay's treaty favored England, the French were dab- doubly angry that the Americans had elected a pro British Federalist as their president. What was more, they took offense at Adams' inaugural address, which they claimed was unfriendly to the French. So they ordered the American minister out of the country and at the same time began harassing American shipping and captured American goods at sea. As for American seamen found on British ships, they announced that they would hang them as soon as they were captured. Madison had never liked John Adams, not only because he was a Federalist, but because Madison had never tried to understand the man beneath his composed manner. Anti French, pro British, he might be, but Adams was not a confirmed a Federalist as Madison imagined him to be. Although he seemed bent on war, neither Madison nor Jefferson realized that it was Alexander Hamilton who was off stage pulling strings behind Adams' back. Retired from the government, Hamilton was nevertheless in control of the cabinet that Adam had inherited from Washington. When in 1798 a peace mission to France failed, Hamilton began immediately to press for a larger army, more taxes, a stronger navy. Adams was not against preparedness, but he had not given up on peace. He appointed Washington commander in chief of this new army, hoping he would provide some measure of moderation. But when Washington made Hamilton his second in command, Adams felt he was losing all control. Besides, John Adams was being attacked mercilessly by Republican newspapers. A sensitive man, he found this hard to take, particularly when they made fun of him personally. Most vicious was a Philadelphia paper edited by Benjamin Batch, grandson of Franklin, who the Federalists nicknamed Lightning Rod Jr. Like other Federalists, Adam did not want a war with France and blamed those newspapers' attacks on the French, working behind the scenes to weaken the government from inside. Critics, according to the Federalists, were no longer patriotic Americans. They must have been French agents. When Benjamin Batch referred to John Adams as old, querulous, bald, blind, toothless Adams, Abigail Adams could stand it no longer as far as she was concerned. This was treason. Nothing, she declared, will have an effect on Batch until they pass a sedition bill, Alien Act, which allowed the president to. Congress apparently agreed. In July 1798, it passed an Alien Act which allowed the president to deport aliens who were citizens of an enemy nation in case of war or threat of war. Even more serious was the Sedition Act, which forbade writing or speaking against the government or the president with the purpose of bringing them into contempt. When a Republican congressman published an article in his hometown newspaper describing Adams as greedy, hungry for power, seeking praise, he was taken to court and found guilty. Here was the most ominous threat yet to the Constitution. Did not no one remember? Madison asked, the First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of speech? Jefferson and Madison, visiting together at Montpelier, agreed that this was an emergency more dangerous perhaps than war itself. The Sedition Act was nothing more, they believed, than a Federalist tactic to silence the Republicans. Moreover, it was a first step toward monarchy. What would the Federalists do next? Sitting on Madison's front porch watching summer lighting, lightning play over the distant mountains, the two men discussed what could be done. They could not depend on courts. The judges were all Federalists, but the states could object. After all, federal power was limited by the Constitution. So Jefferson went home and wrote the Kentucky Resolves, protesting that the Alien and Sedition Act were unconstitutional. And Madison wrote the Virginia Resolves. Both sets of resolves passed the two states' legislatures, but Jefferson, apt to be more hot headed than Madison, went so far as to say a state could actually nullify federal acts it considered unconstitutional. Madison said this was going too far. This suggested that a state had a right to secede from a union, and that was the first thing that could happen. What good was the Constitution if it didn't keep the Union together. Jefferson agreed. He had gone too far. Bringing the Federalists down, did Madison really think he could keep out the politics at this critical point in the nation's development? He said. So, when a delegate of Republican called on Madison to ask him to run for the state legislature, he said no. He said no several times. He had retired, but then he was told Patrick Henry might be running, not to support his principle, but simply because he hated Madison and Jefferson so much. Well, in that case, Madison said he would run, and of course he was elected. In the following years, two important events changed the color of American politics. John Adams, in effect, split the Federalist Party. He simply could not stand Alexander Hamilton's meddling any longer, so he fired his cabinet, which Hamilton had controlled. Then he ruined Hamilton's well laid plans for a war, secretly exploring peace possibilities with France. He found a way to restore relations. Wrong headed John Adams might be at times, but he was an independent man. And though wanted desperately to be reelected, he knew that he might have wrecked his chance still. He didn't regret what he had done. To the day he died, he took pride in the fact that he had almost single handedly kept America out of war. Overshadowing everything, however, was the fact that on December 14th, 1799, George Washington died. Of course, the people knew this would happen sometime, yet they felt that they had been suddenly robbed of their security. How could they get along without Washington? They went to such extravagant lengths in their mournings. It was as if they hoped to find strength in simply by glorifying him. Mock funerals were held throughout the country, statues were built, streets renamed, and newspapers were so busy finding adjectives to apply to Washington. Sainted, peerless, revered, heroic, immortal, that they scarcely had time to talk about the coming election. The Federalists put up Adams for president and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney for vice president. The Republicans put up Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr for vice president. The understanding was clear in both parties just which man was meant to be president, and it was expected that the electors would not split their votes. But behind the scene, Hamilton, who hated Adams, was plotting for Pinckney to receive more votes, and Aaron Burr, in an underhanded way, was plotting for his own victory. If it had all worked out the way Burr planned, he would have been elected president. But at last minute, the New York elector, who had promised to keep Jefferson's name off his ballot, was prevented from doing so by other Republican electors. The result was that Jefferson and Burr were tied from the presidency. The Constitution had provided for such an emergency. In the case of a tie, the House of Representatives would decide between the two candidates. In the beginning, Burr made generous sounding statements that he would step aside because, of course, the Republicans had meant to elect Jefferson, but he had nothing officially. So on February 11th, the House of Representatives voted and voted again and again. After 3 days and 32 ballots, the vote was still tied. Finally, on the 34th ballot, Thomas Jefferson was declared the President of the United States. As for Aaron Burr, he might be Vice President, but whether he knew it or not, his political career was finished. Neither the Federalists nor the Republicans trusted him, and certainly Dolly and James didn't. James Madison commented on the election. Wasn't it lucky that the country didn't have a standing army? In any other country, an army might have been used to seize power. But in spite of political maneuvers, the Constitution had worked. And now Madison knew that he too was headed back into the thick of government. In the early day of the campaign, he had promised that if Jefferson was elected, he would serve in his cabinet as Secretary of State. James and Dolly had hoped to attend Jefferson's inauguration on March 4th, but in the last week of February, James, his father, had died because James needed to take care of his father's affairs and because he was himself ill. James was kept at Montpelier for almost 2 months, but on May 1, 1801, leaving the flowering red buds behind, Madison arrived in the half built capital at Washington, D.C., ready to take up a new life. For Madison, this meant a new chance for America. Working together, surely he and Jefferson would be able to swing the country back into line, establishing it firmly on Republican principles.